Hello, historians. Mr. Spalding here. We're looking at the Industrial Revolution. On Thursday, my goal is to go over the test and to answer any questions you may have. I'm planning to do a Google Meet on Thursday, so please make sure you're here on time. Today, we're focused on the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and I'm going to be asking you to watch these notes and then to listen to a podcast. Now, you can listen to this over your computer. You don't have to have a podcast player for this. Listen to a podcast from the BBC. That's the British Broadcasting Corporation in Britain. It's a discussion among three historians and a moderator about the Industrial Revolution. And you don't have to understand every single thing about it. But I do want you to make some notes as you're listening about some of the main ideas, because these are really well-respected scholars who are talking about the Industrial Revolution in ways that show that history is full of debate and discussion, and it's not just facts. So this is a fantastic insight into the discussions that historians have about evidence as we're trying to put together a picture of what happened in the past. After my lecture, and after you listen to the BBC podcast, I'm going to be asking you to compose 10 statements concerning the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Each statement should include 2 or more specific facts, such as names, events, dates, years, places, or significance or development, correct spelling of these facts, and the statement should be clear and accurate. I've provided an example and a form for you to do this on, or a page here for you to do this on. If there's any questions, please post them on the comments section in Classroom below the assignment so I can answer them for everybody's benefit. And thank you for your emails. I am feeling better than I felt earlier this week, and looking forward to seeing and interacting with you tomorrow, all things being well. So let's think about the Industrial Revolution in Britain. I'm going to go through this very quickly, so you can pause it as you need to add to your notes and make changes or additions to your notes. I've also posted this PowerPoint so you can go back and look at it. You may want to refer to your textbook for further details. First off, so why does the Industrial Revolution begin in Britain, and how did it happen? Well, on a blank sheet of paper, we're going to look at the Industrial Revolution and what were some of the reasons that it comes to Britain first. In many ways, the Industrial Revolution can be considered a hinge of history or a turning point of history. If we use our chess categories, culture, human environment interaction, economics, state and politics, social organization, and groupings, to think about the antecedents. Antecedent is something that goes before. What came before the Industrial Revolution? Why does it happen in Britain? Well, when in these notes that you're going to make right here, I'm going to ask you to note down what are some of the changes that occur in the Industrial Revolution. Why can we call this a turning point in history? Well, in terms of culture, the number one thing in terms of culture is that we, as a human species, start to think of change as being a normal part of our existence. Change. Through most of human history, there was not a huge amount of change in technology, in ways of living. Yes, there were political changes. Kings and queens come and go, empires come and go, but the course of life for common people involved very little change from generation to generation. Most of humanity was focused on agriculture or hunting and gathering before that. There was trade, and that trade definitely influenced the movement of people. There were nomadic groups that influenced the exchange of cultures. But if you were part of a nomadic group, or you were part of an agrarian group or a trade group, your life probably wasn't much different than that of your grandparents, and their life hadn't been much different than that of their grandparents. But with the Industrial Revolution, we get the expectation of change. It is unlikely that you think you're going to do the exact thing that your grandparents did. And that turning point is part of the Industrial Revolution. In human environment interaction, we have the rapid development of technologies that affect the environment. We have the digging of canals. Now, there were canals dug by the Assyrians and the Egyptians, but these were exceptions to the rule. Chinese dug a grand canal. But we have an explosion of canal building in many parts of the world during this time. We have a development of railroads, the development of the telegraph, the rapid urbanization of the world's population, and the exploitation of natural resources like coal in coal mining on a scale that we've never seen before in human history. With that, we get the development of pollution that we'd never seen before in all of human history. In terms of economics, we get new systems of labor, wage labor being one of them. Now, wage labor was not a completely new system, but the amount of people who were wage laborers, in other words, working for a payment in cash, exploded during this time period. Prior to this time period, most of the people in the world were agricultural laborers who labored for a bit of the produce that they produced, or there were slave laborers, or there were sharecroppers, not wage earners. So the explosion of wage labor. We have new banking systems, new trade routes, new sources of wealth, and the development of capitalism on a large scale. We have a movement from home production to factory production. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most cloth that was produced in Europe and in most parts of the world, in fact, everywhere in the world, was produced in homes or small workshops. During the revolution, this changes. Most cloth in the world by the end of the 1800s is produced in large factories. So that's a huge change from home-based production to factory-based production. In the state and politics, we have changes in concepts of rights. What are our rights, and what is the role of the state in guaranteeing these rights? What is the state role in the economy? The state becomes intimately involved in the economy in new and different ways during this time period. We have the concept of widespread suffrage. Suffrage means the right to vote, and the concept of widespread citizenship. These developed during the Industrial Revolution, partly because of these new industries and urbanization. And finally, we have changes in social organizations and groupings. One of the most significant changes is the rise of women's rights activism. We also have the growth of a large working class, people who are working for wages, who do not have a connection to the land. They do not live on the land or own land. They live in apartments owned by someone else. We have a rise of a managerial class, who manage and operate the factories and industries. We have a rise of a capitalist class, the owners of the factories. We have vast urbanization, and we have women working outside the house in larger numbers than ever before in human history. So these are huge changes that occurred during the late 1700s and through the 1800s. They begin on a large scale in Britain and affect the whole course of world history. On a separate piece of paper, I'd like you to make this diagram. I'm going to move ahead so you can put this on pause to make the diagram. First off, a whole set of ideas influence the development of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Ideas about concentrating production in a single location, that's the factory. Mercantilism, the idea that a country benefits from controlling all aspects of trade. That led to colonialism, that's the control and domination of other lands and peoples beyond your own physical land. The acceptance and encouragement of innovation and incentive to innovate. To innovate is to make something new and different. This is the inventors. Enlightenment thinkers, we'll be looking at those next week. And the Reformation and the thought and changes in perspective that the Reformation brought. These ideas profoundly affect the development of the Industrial Revolution. Next, we have machines, materials, and market. We'll start with materials. England has a naturally occurring and easily accessible, relatively easily accessible iron and coal. And later, cotton from the colonies and former colonies. This cotton was obtained from India, from America, and from Egypt. All areas that were controlled or were once controlled by Britain. So Britain had materials with which to produce goods, in this case, textiles. Textiles meaning cloth and cloth products. Next, they had machines that were invented by British folks or that were invented outside Britain and improved by Britons. And your book discusses these in more detail. And later on in the slideshow, which I'd like you to examine on your own, there are images of the spinning jenny, the water frame, the mule, and the power loom. And then Britain had a market. Market means a place to sell your goods, not necessarily a single place, but a region or a set of buyers. So market here meaning the population in England. So England had a rapid population growth, rapid urbanization, and so there were people willing and able to buy the goods that their factories produced. England also had a colonial empire where they sold their goods. So I should have added that bullet point on there too for market, colonial empire. Finally, Britain had sources of power. There were rivers for water power, and then later with the development of steam engines, the use of steam power, the steam being produced by burning coal. So there's this amazing connection of coal resources and the ability to produce steam power. What are some of the results? Social change and challenge and tremendous profit. Profit seeks investment. If you have profit, you want to put it somewhere. You don't want to just save it. You want to put it somewhere if you're a business person. So that inspires imperialism and further industrialization. So we have kind of this growth cycle that occurs in Britain. You do not need to write these things down, but you should be aware of this. one of the questions is, why didn't the French industrialize at the same time, at the same rate, or as quickly as the British? Well, they did have some legal protections for business. They had standard weights and measures, they had technical schools, they had official government encouragement, and they had a reliable bank. But they had lots of wars, heavy debts because of these wars, high unemployment, and businessmen who were afraid to take risks. So they didn't have entrepreneurs willing to take risks on factories in the same amount that the British did. The development of world trade in this time period profoundly affects industrialization, both because it provided raw materials like cotton and because it provided an incentive. As the Spanish took control of silver resources in the Americas and were able to trade with Asia, Britain also wished to be part of that silver trade, and in fact engaged in a significant amount of silver trade and trade with Asia. Eventually, fighting a war with the Dutch, the Netherlands is the country, the Dutch are the people, fighting a war with the Dutch and taking over much of the former Dutch trade routes between Europe and Asia. Your book talks a little bit about the enclosure movement, and there's a little video attached to this that you can watch. It basically meant that public lands that were once used by common folks were fenced off and eventually passed to the control of large landowners. This meant that more and more people were without land to produce their own crops and became wage laborers, or laborers free to move about the land in search of work. This is a picture of some lands in England today. The patchwork shows lands that had been once enclosed, and it's very pretty now, but it affected the economy tremendously. This map shows locations of metal, woolen production and the development of canals. Canals are important because they allow the movement of goods easily. You can push a boat that weighs many tons. You can push it physically. You can. Each one of you in class could do that. Now, you might not be able to push it very far, but you can move it. So movement of goods by boat is very efficient in terms of energy. It is much easier than movement by road, and a time before pavement was invented and roads were terrible. So this huge system of canals made it possible to move coal and woolen goods and metals throughout England. Okay. Canals are a very important source of transportation during the Industrial Revolution in Britain. We have some canals here in Connecticut, and we'll talk about those more tomorrow. I'll let you read this on your own. The development of metallurgy and metal producing processes in Europe and in Britain made it possible to produce steel, which made it possible to produce more durable machines and larger machines. Here you can see the development of railroads and how railroads connected coal mining areas and urban areas that were the sites of factories. They also connected iron producing areas. So between the railroads and the canals, Britain in the 1800s became very well connected. So you can note, I want you to think about this chart here. 1 ton of coal took 50,000 miners. 200,000 miners is 4 times the amount of miners, but we have 30 times the amount of coal. Why is there such a jump? Well, there's better technology. And that's one of the things that happens during the Industrial Revolution. There's improvements in technology that enable incredible amounts of production. In this case of coal, and in the case of textiles, of cloth. One person could produce a lot more using machines than they could on a loom. Notice a decline from 1880 to 1914. There's more people working, but fewer produced. That's because the coal that's easy to get has been gotten. And you have to go farther down. It's much harder to get, even though they have better technology. So coal mining becomes more difficult. Coal mining was difficult, hard labor. Children were used and used up. It was dangerous because the coal dust gets into your lungs, creates tuberculosis. So the life expectancy for children in coal mines was low, for adults as well. Coal and iron ore. Ore is the raw rock that's pulled out of the ground. Coal is used to heat the furnace. The furnace is where you put the rock. When you heat the rock, then you separate the iron ore from the other parts of the rock, and you get pieces of iron. That's called pig iron. Is that raw iron that you then use to make parts for machines. So you see here the development of the production of raw iron from the iron ore, huge amount, huge change. Where is all this iron going? Well, it's going to railroads, it's going to machines. It's producing the goods required to create other goods. So why textiles? Well, textiles require a process. The process starts with raw cotton. Then it goes to ginning and carding, which separate the seeds from the cotton. Then spinning to make thread. That used to be done by hand. You can see the woman in the upper right-hand corner spinning thread from the raw cotton that's clumped up. And then you take those threads and you weave them to make cloth. In Britain, we get a series of inventions that are able to produce thread and cloth and weave cloth much more rapidly. So with the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom, three of the earliest inventions. In your textbook, these are described in more detail. Arkwright becomes the pioneer of the factory system. That's a system where you can put lots of machines under one roof. And you're often using different kinds of machines so that you can bring the raw cotton in one end of the factory, and the other end of the factory, you can bring out cloth. Eli Whitney, an American inventor, he's actually from Connecticut. He invented a machine that would quickly remove the seeds from the raw cotton. That increased the amount of cotton that could be produced by a single person, amount of clean cotton. Factory production. Note these 4 bullet points, important to defining what factory production is. Do note that only 10% of English industry in 1850 was in factories. That increases dramatically by the end of the 1900s. So the factory system employed a rigid schedule. It was dangerous, and it required you to do the same thing over and over and over again. So note the number of workers being employed. All of these workers are wage workers. So this is part of the wage revolution that happens in England. These people are no longer living in agricultural areas as farm laborers. They're now living in urban areas and working for wages. The work was often dangerous. Notice the detail on these coins. Notice the date. You wouldn't put something on a coin unless it was important or novel. The fact they put grain on one side and they put a factory on the other side is very significant. Notice a young girl in the foreground of this lithotype. Young children were used in mills because they had small hands that could fit in between the parts of the machine. And yes, many of them were injured in the midst of their work. Okay. Britain was not the only place where there were inventions made. A Frenchman named Jacquard created a loom that would create beautiful patterns. The British also used these techniques, but the French were more well known for these fancy patterns of cloth. So I'm not going to describe each of these inventions. They're described more in your textbook, but the flying shuttle was one of the earliest and most important developments in the production of cotton. Then the power loom. Notice the belts connecting the loom to these barrels at the top. Those barrels at the top were driven by turning spindles. Those spindles were turned by water power or sometimes by a steam engine. So this was water or steam powered. The steam engine was invented first to remove water from mines so that miners could go more deeply into the mines. After the water was removed, the steam engine was later employed to turn wheels in factories, turn looms in factories, and then later mounted to a machine that we call the steam engine. Steam tractor was not very effective. It was too heavy to use on the land. Steam ship was very effective and transformed the imperialism and transformed trade. And here we have one of the first steam engines mounted on rails. So notice the time difference from the left to the right. You should pause the image and notice the difference in time taken to travel by land and by rail. And also note that most of the steam engine travel was not for passengers, but for goods. Steam engines take up a lot of land, and here we have a human environment interaction. Much land is required for right-of-way to put down tracks. You should read about this Crystal Palace exhibition in your textbook. In Britain, it was a collection of British inventions, but also inventions and products from around the British Empire and around the world. It showed the power of Britain as an empire, but it also showed the importance of this industrial revolution that had begun in Britain and was beginning to affect the rest of the world. Okay, so once again, we're going back to our notes. Why Britain and why textiles? Do take note of these and add to these notes from the slides and from the links on the slides. Now, please watch the video. Listen to the audio from the BBC, add to your notes, and then do the written work.